It's shocking to me that the Alamo doesn't have a museum. Think about that. Everywhere else has a museum. Gettysburg has a museum. Fort McHenry has a museum. Everywhere. You go to Warwick Castle in England, they have a museum. They're nowhere near as famous as the Alamo. The Alamo doesn't have a museum. It had one for a few years in the 30s because the WPA came and built a bunch of stuff. But that was converted later to the gift shop, I think in the 50s or 60s. The Alamo does not have a proper museum. One of the things we have to have at the Alamo is a museum to help tell its story. That's what Phil Collins has donated for. We also have an Alamo collection of its own right that we don't have the space to display. We've never had the space to display. We used to have some displays inside the church, but the church itself is an artifact. It's actually the most important artifact in the state of Texas. I would argue at least top 5 most important artifacts in the United States. It is an artifact in itself. It's not really a museum. So we're going to build a museum that the Alamo doesn't have, but deserves and has always deserved. And I would just ask, the fact that the Alamo doesn't have a museum, is this acceptable? I think it's not. We at the GLO, Commissioner Bush thinks it's not acceptable that we don't have this, so we're going to build it. And I'll just finish with one last thought, which this is our generation's task as Texans. Preserve the Alamo, build this museum, save its story, tell its story better than ever before. It's not us who does it. Who's going to do it? Some later generation that's even farther away from the story? And if we don't do it now, when's it going to get done? It's never going to get done.
As Texans, what can we do to support this?
Very, very good question. The first thing you can do to support this,
As Texans, what can we do to support this?
and that's an excellent question. The first thing you can do to support this is whenever you hear misconceptions about these plans out there, correct it or fact check with us. I'm going to give you my email address, which I think is in here. Those are actually the 5 points of the master plan that I passed around. There it is. Check with me, please. I'm the Director of Communications at the Land Office. I am very deeply involved in this project. I am very deeply involved in this project. Like I said, I wrote part of the buoy exhibit. The buoy exhibit, by the way, I'll brag about this a little bit. When you tell history to rising generations, you don't always have a very receptive audience. Kids don't like history. Most kids don't like history. Most kids, when they're growing up, and I have a 17-year-old son, so I know this firsthand, they live like this, okay? They're constantly poking around on their phones, they're constantly touching stuff. This is how they learn now. When they run into a question they don't know the answer, what do? They Google it on their phone. Touch technology is so much more deeply embedded in their brains than it ever will be in our brains. We just didn't grow up with this technology the way they do. I grew up with the Atari and TV, so that technology is very much part of my DNA now. For the rising generations, this is the technology that this is embedded in their brains. So one of the things we did with the buoy exhibit was find a way to bring touch into a museum exhibit. What's the first thing you're told when you walk into a museum? Anyway, thank you. Don't touch anything. So what we did was we worked with some companies to get this technology in the United States. First time ever it's been used in a museum. That is it's an artifact display case that has translucent glass on the front of it. You touch that glass and you interact with the artifacts inside. First time it's ever been used in the U.S. And the reason we use that is so that we can dive back to 1836 so that people can interact with these artifacts, and they can do it in ways that rising generations understand. We have this incredible story to tell. We just have to find better ways to tell it. The same story. It's sort of like if you're a preacher. I grew up in Southern Baptist Church. I was a deacon for a few years up in Baltimore, and you have this great story to tell, and you need to find ways to tell it to connect to people. Technology is one way we can do that, but the best thing we can do is just get people to the Alamo, give them things to do, give them things to interact with, and teach this story to them so that they take a part of the Alamo story back with them. What I really hope to see, the Alamo is a global attraction. People from all over the world come to the Alamo. What they should learn about is what it means to be a Texan. And then they can go back to wherever they're from, and they take a little piece of that story back with them. It may not click with them immediately, but down the line it will. I don't know who had their hand up first.
You know, the city of Washington, or the state of Texas, carved out a piece of the city of Washington for the Public Museum.
Yeah.
There's no reason why you can't do that for the Alamo. So your goals are attainable.
They are attainable.
Um,
We're having to work with the city of San Antonio the way the state had to work with the city of Austin.
But is I know the Bullock Museum is very politicized. Are they involved at all?
Nope, we're not.
That's good.
Yeah. Ethan?
So if George P. runs for another office and you leave the company, who do we come to get the straight shoot from?
Well, I'm going to be there for at least the next 4 years. After that, I don't know. But I'll be there for the duration. This project is near and dear to his heart, near and dear to my heart, obviously. Like I warned you guys in email, I can talk about this all day. You know, it's hard to shut me up once you're talking about this. So I'll be there for at least the next 4, which means we'll be there through the bulk of this project to keep it on track and to keep it going the way it's supposed to go.
Couple of questions.
Yeah.
I think your 360-degree slider imager thing,
Mhm.
now, pretty cool.
Yeah.
Is that on the web or?
Not yet.
Can you need to put it on the web?
Yes, we are, just to give you the skinny on that, Jim Body, the gentleman who created the 1836 version, he lives in Georgia. I've been in contact about it, I called him up, had good conversations with him. We are not at the stage yet where we can go public on the web. We're going to, because what we need to do is show people what's been lost, what's there now, what we're trying to do, and this tool is one way to do
So
it.
that was based on
That's the
his
point.
model?
Yeah. And his model, just so people know, his model is so accurate because it's based on 2 things that precede it. It's based on Mark Lemon's book, The Illustrated Alamo, from a few years back. That's where he gets those textures in that book. It's based on that. Mark Lemon's book, in turn, is based on a diorama that Phil Collins owns. So we're back to Phil Collins again. That diorama is, as far as I know, the most accurate diorama that's ever been built. And
How
if you
big
look,
is this model?
I want to say it's about 10 feet across by about 8 or 9 feet deep, something like that. It's a very large model. And the detail on it, it used to be in the history shop across the street from the Alamo. We bought that shop from Phil. Phil was part owner of it. We bought it from him about a year ago, I guess. So it's closed down now. That diorama is actually too big to pull out of that building. But we're going to get, because it's huge, we're going to get that diorama out of that building, and it's going to have a place somewhere at the Alamo. One of the things, one of the items that Phil Collins collected was dioramas. He collected a number of them. Several of them will be going up at the Alamo fairly soon. They're in bronze, so they can actually sit outside and people can see the Alamo as it changed over time through these dioramas. That diorama is an indoor diorama that has to be kept indoors somewhere. But just so you know, that model is that accurate because it has that much history behind it. And it's, as soon as I saw it online, when Jim Body posted it on Facebook, I thought I have to reach out to this guy. First I have to find out if it's accurate. So I sent it to our historian, Dr. Bruce Winders, who's been there for 21, 22 years, something like that. And like I said, his only quibble with it was there was too much grass inside the courtyard. That's not much of a quibble, because that's an artist's interpretation. But he said the model was accurate. So having ascertained its accuracy, I reached out to Jim and said, hey, can we work together?
Okay. Second question.
Yeah.
What do you know about Odessa? Probably the most famous
Yeah.
rifle in the West.
We know a lot.
You do know.
Yeah.
Can you tell us?
No. I believe it's part of the Phil Collins collection, but I have not seen it with my own eyes.
Well, when these things are put on display, will it have Phil Collins studying it, or will they not do that because it's him and somebody might try to swipe his stuff?
That's actually a good question. Phil Collins' collection is worth between 15 and 30 million, depending on how the market is on any given day and how artifacts are ascertained as to their historic authenticity. The museum that we build can't just be any old place where you put stuff in a glass case. It has to be able to preserve these artifacts. Many of these artifacts are knives, weapons, guns. Many of them are textiles. Many of them are papers, things like that. He has the arrest warrant for some of the Texas leaders that the Mexican government issued, which actually started the war, more or less. He has pieces like that. We have to preserve them, and that requires individual preservation for each piece. We have to protect them from thieves, because many of these items are worth a lot of money. That Bowie knife that I mentioned, the Musso knife, is worth probably a couple million by itself. And then we have to display them as well. So we have to take all of that into account, save them, preserve them, protect them from thieves and what have you. So that's one of the reasons this museum is going to cost a little bit, is to do all of that. You mentioned it at Adelaide. Yeah, 2024. Collins, substantial progress on the museum by. Collins is very reasonable. And by the way, he's very supportive of these plans too, because he, as a lifelong Alamo supporter, wants to see these artifacts displayed, as do we all. We just have to do it right. So when he made his donation in 2014, there was the stipulation that you have to have made substantial progress by 2024. That date was chosen because that's the 300th anniversary of the Alamo being placed on its current site. It had 2 different sites prior. Not a lot of good archaeology on those 2 prior sites. One is thought to have been found, I think it's the Heritage Center in San Antonio. There was some archaeology that was done there in 2015-16, that there was some site there that dates to the right period. It might have been the first Alamo site. But the current site dates to 1724. So
he's donated all that, I mean, has he completely stopped collecting? Or
No.
He continues on and may, in the future, make another big donation?
yeah, yes, that's very
I wonder
possible.
where he gets his things from. I mean, does he get it from individual buyers, or is there a place that had a lot of this?
It's-
the bulk of it?
It's a variety. Some of them were in private hands or in individuals' hands that he went and bought. I'll tell you, he actually discovered some of them. The history shop sits just off of, it's across Houston Street from the Alamo, the back side wall. The history shop sits on a spot that Phil researched and determined that there was probably a camp there at some point around the time of the battle. And so he very quietly purchased that shop and became part owner of it. And he and the owner, quietly at night after it was closed, they dug through the floor where Phil thought there would be artifacts, and he was right. There were artifacts under that shop. He found horseshoes and cannonballs and things like that. They clearly date to the right period and are right. So he did that, and he continues quietly to collect. Now, the thing you don't want to say when you're a collector is, yeah, I'm collecting, because then prices go up immediately. And we've had actually the same issue with the properties around the Alamo. That's very valuable real estate anyway, because it's downtown San Antonio and it's right by the Alamo. But we have been more or less quiet about a lot of our real estate acquisitions, simply because with every acquisition you drive the price up of other acquisitions. So that's just a reality we have to deal with.
With the purchase of that building and in doing that, at some point this, I don't know, the city of San Antonio or somebody, government, try to claim that he needs to hand that over, like maybe they have some sort of a right to that
No.
ground, what's underneath the ground or something, because it is historical stuff.
That has not come up yet. I don't think it will. The way archaeology law in Texas is kind of interesting. If artifacts are found, and I'm not a lawyer, so I may say stuff that's not entirely accurate on this. The way I understand the archaeological laws in the state of Texas, if artifacts are found on private property, they belong to the current owner of that property. So in this case, Phil was part owner of that property, so they belong to him, and then he donated them to the state. If they are found on public property, then there's an issue of whether it's city, county, state, some jurisdiction, whatever.
But this is not well known. I mean, all of what you're just saying, it's
No.
not like this, the building he owns and
Right.
what it is.
No, that's not well known. Some of that is in his book. Some of that is,
What's the name of the foundation?
which one?
What's the name of the nonprofit?
Okay, there are 3 nonprofits that are in on this. There is the Alamo Endowment Board, which is sort of the top one. That's the one that Patterson actually started and reconstituted. Its purpose is fundraising for the Alamo. It's a capital fundraising campaign.
Okay.
Beneath that is the Remember the Alamo Foundation, which is where the funds will go that the Alamo Endowment Board raises. It's just the name of the foundation, the account, basically. And then connected to that is what was called Alamo Complex Management, has been changed in the past week or two to the Alamo Trust. That's the nonprofit that actually operates the Alamo day-to-day, that employs the folks that work down there. Their benefits are all through that company. It's a nonprofit, 501c3. Now, I know that the previous commissioner has argued on the Trey Ware show in San Antonio, I believe, that we should have made all these folks state employees. That would have been illegal. At the time that he was commissioner, there was every agency has a cap on how many employees they can have. At the GLO, our cap was 650 employees. When we came in 2015, we had around 630 employees. To have made the 100 employees at the Alamo, state employees, would have been to go over that cap. We would have been allowed to do it. They would have had to go to the legislature and get special legislation, special dispensation, essentially to raise that cap. There's also a good argument for not making government bigger. Why make them state employees if you don't get them?
I like the way you talk.
Good. I like, yes.
Good.
In fact, the Alamo Endowment Board itself reports its financials. They're technically a private organization, but they are a charity, so they report their financials to two places. The IRS, I'm sure no one here is a friend of them, and to GuideStar.com, which is a reputable charitable foundation. You can find their entire financials there on
How
GuideStar.
about open meetings?
Well, they are, as a private organization, not technically subject to open meetings. However, we do get their minutes at the GLO, and we are happy to provide those minutes. We do.
So you don't post them, you have to request them?
Yeah. But we can post them if folks
And there's
decide
also
to do that.
rules about minutes and nonprofits. I've made very explicit minutes and then people don't like those, and so some people just make, oh, A, B, C, and that's it. Have you looked at the minutes, or do they tell you much?
They tell you what's going on. Yeah. We're not hiding anything with this. The Alamo is the most visible artifact, the most visible site in the state of Texas. We get between 1.3 and 1.7 million visitors there per year. The fact is, the Alamo is the most sacred mission we have at the GLO because it's the heart of Texas. And we've been accused of all of these things. We are not hiding anything. We have been open and transparent throughout this process.
Well, what people want to know
Yeah,
is the financials.
that's one thing they want to know.
Where the money comes from and
Yeah.
where the money goes, and whose hands it passes through, and what kind of relationships are there between these people, past and present.
Sure,
That's what people want to know.
that's fair.
They want
That's
to
fair.
make their own judgment. Is there a conflict of interest? Is there some crony capitalism
Always a
going on?
conflict of interest.
And so, if that information isn't available, then it just causes a problem.
Yeah, and it is available.
Well,
So,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go look, I'll tell you right now,
Go ahead.
that I am intimately familiar with the city of Georgetown's finances,
Yes, he is.
okay? I would,
As citizens, we all ought to be.
so,
Our
that's
respective
my
jurisdictions.
standard.
Mhm.
Can I go to your website and find the same level of information?
You'll find a greater level of information because we're subject to SB 20 and they are not. And you can request any of the financials from us that
Well,
we've
I'm
got
gonna go read
collected.
SB 20.
Go ahead.
Because just because you're in compliance with them, still
Well,
may
that is
still
the
may-
law. That's the
that's
universe in
law,
which we live.
But that may not answer all the transparency questions.
Yes.
have you,
So that's the issue.
Oh, I thought you had a question.
have you been in contact with any private historians? Do you consult with them?
Yeah, kind of. What do you mean?
There's a physician in Austin named Jeff Kerr.
Don't know him?
You need to.
Okay. Be happy, please provide me his information.
Yeah.
Or reach out.
He's written several books.
Yeah.
And phenomenal guy. He's also a good photographer.
Okay. We're in contact with many. We're in contact, for instance, with Dr. Greg Dimmick, who is he's actually a pediatrician down in Wharton County, but he led archaeological digs in the 1990s down in that area. There's a little known part of Texas history that he dug up. That little known part of Texas.
Literally.
Yeah, literally. And that little known part is what happened to the Mexican army units after San Jacinto. What did they do? Hardly anybody knows the answer to this question. What did they do? They had 5,000 or 6,000 troops in Texas, well beyond the number that Sam Houston had under his command.
You just told us 1,000 went to the Alamo.
And there was 1,000 sitting at the Alamo. What did they all do? Well, what happened was Sam Houston and his troops were able to capture Santa Anna, and Sam Houston kept him alive long enough to get his surrender, and so that Santa Anna would order those troops to leave. There was a big debate between Santa Anna's top two generals, Felice Sola on the one hand, Urea on the other hand. Urea was in charge at Goliad, the massacre. Felice Sola was the Italian who was actually in second in command. Felice Sola felt honor-bound to follow Santa Anna's order. Santa Anna's order was, get out. We have to recognize Texas or they're going to kill me. So get out. Urea wanted to continue fighting. And they had a debate. Filisola outranked them, so they left. I bring all this up just to say that Dr. Dimick, we're in contact with him, he led the archaeological digs in the 90s that determined the route by which the Mexican army left Texas. Which is a very cool story. They actually, it became almost a biblical story because the Mexican army on their way out, they've just had this shocking loss. Santa Anna, the Napoleon of the West, has been taken unawares by Sam Houston, this guy that was regarded as a drunk, incompetent, all this, and Sam Houston has bested him on the battlefield. Santa Anna orders them to leave. They don't want to leave, but they have to leave. They start marching out of Texas, and they get monsoon rains the whole time they're marching out. So this was called the Mar de Lodo, or Sea of Mud, and you'll see that book by Dr. Dimick that's out there. It's a fascinating read because the Mexican army was just hammered by weather the whole time they're marching out. And they're marching out in defeat and disgrace, and there's this debate between the two generals, Filisola and Urea, for years afterward. Because they're both pointing the finger. It's your fault, not your fault. Not your. So you have these historic records in the newspapers, kind of like what we see now with blogs, where people are going at each other in a blog war. These guys were doing that in the papers in Mexico and in books back in the day. So we're in contact with.
Santa Anna.
Pardon?
How come they didn't blame Santa Anna?
They did, and he was kicked in and out of office about a dozen times. After that, he was thrown out, back in, thrown out, back in. His history is crazy too. He's actually still hated on both sides of the border because he was a tyrant to us. To them, he was incompetent, who just kept seizing power for himself. So we're in contact with folks like Dr. Dimick, we're in contact with folks like Dr. Hardin, Murray State, we're in contact. Of course, we have the best historian in the world in the Alamo working for us, who is Dr. Bruce Winters. And you can go down there and talk to him anytime. He's down there 6-7 days a
So
week.
is there a list of these really good books posted anywhere?
Not that I know of. I keep running on, yeah, it's a good idea. I keep running into them as I do research on these things. For instance, doing the research on the Bowie exhibit, you run into all kinds of books. I used to have a blog.
Or at least a place?
Actually, the Alamo does have a blog. It's on Medium. Dr. Winters typically writes it. I'm not the historian. I'm a communications guy.
Love to,
Yeah,
love to see a list of these books to.
it's a good idea. You know what? I'll get Dr. Winters on that. Because we should have Mark Lemon's book on there. We should have Dimick's book.
But that also,
Dimick's book
that
is
also
fascinating.
lines you up for gift shop things.
Yeah. All right. I like what you think.
I think coming back to the Phil Collins and all the
Yeah.
other artifacts, are they all well preserved now, or
Yes.
do they all, you know, are you having anything like,
Like conservation done or
yeah,
anything?
anything like that?
We are, like everything with the Alamo, the answer is not simple. All of the artifacts are currently protected in our vaults. Our vaults in the GLO, I don't want to give descriptions or anything, but they're climate controlled, they're temperature controlled, they are away from, they're fire protected, they're flood protected, they're extremely secure vaults that we have at the GLO because we have all these precious artifacts. And we have had this archive going back now for 181 years. So all of that is happening currently. We do have a conservation program at the GLO called Save Texas History, and you can find their information, our information about that, savetexashistory.org. I encourage y'all to go check that out. That is actually a privately funded conservation program through GLO. Tax dollars don't actually pay for it. Private donations typically pay for it, but what they're conserving there are maps. We have maps original maps going back into the 1500s that show the increase of information of Texas through time, essentially. Going back to the early European maps that just show empty land with buffaloes running around, to current maps today that are GPS and all of that. So we have this conservation program. It's been going on for a number of years. As we see that artifacts need conservation, we do conservation. For instance, the cannons that we talked about. There's another, I'm going to tell you guys something that's top secret. There was a knife that was found, yeah, doesn't leave this room. There was a knife that was found during Dr. Dimick's digs years ago, back in the 90s, that, get this, is a James Black Bowie knife. Was found on the coast of Texas in a site that was occupied, known to have been occupied by the Mexican army. How did it get there? I don't know yet. Exactly. We know it's a James Black because it has the coffin handle shape, and there's a specific rivet pattern that he used when he built his knives. It's a verified James Black. How did it get there? I don't know. That knife is currently in the Cushing Library at Texas A&M. And I've been talking to the conservationists there, the folks who are working on this cannon conservation we're doing, told them about that knife. Now they're going to conserve that knife for free. I'm very curious about that knife. I'm not going to say what I think that knife is, I think you can probably infer what I think that knife is. But those kinds of conservation projects are going on behind the scenes all the time.
Is he still digging in that building?
No, he's not digging there. That building currently is closed. I think it still
So
has
he's
his
not
guard.
digging there, where's he digging?
He's not digging at the moment that I'm aware of. He doesn't tell us everything he's doing. What I think he's doing, what we know he's doing, is he is still acquiring artifacts the way he's acquired them mostly in the past, which is going to collectors and making them an offer, or going to artifact. There are artifact conventions, like there's a gun show. There are conventions of that sort of thing, and he goes to those. He'll just pop up. He's an interesting cat. In I think it was late 2015, we got a call from the staff at the Alamo at the time, and they asked us, "Hey, you guys doing something with Phil Collins today?" This is out of the blue, random. No, we're not. We, check the schedule. No, we're not expecting him. He was in the gift shop at the Alamo, just shopping. He was like holding a Davy Crockett mug that said, "Go to hell, I'm going to Texas." When they called us up, he just shows up sometimes at the Alamo just to take in the vibes there. I've met him a couple of times, got to show off some of our technology to him, just got to chat with him. I'm a drummer, so I got to chat with him about drumming. He's a very interesting individual, and he strongly loves the Alamo. I think he's a British guy who, grew up and played drums for prog rock and all that stuff.
Jimmy Buffett's very similar.
Really?
Very similar. He's a philanthropist who gets involved in his causes.
For the Alamo?
Not for the Alamo,
Okay.
but I mean, you could probably steer it that way.
Maybe we could. There are a number of private collectors out there that we know of, that we've had conversations with. Don't want to go public with any of it yet.
Does he have a home?
Florida.
Okay.
He has a home in Florida that he bought from GLO.
Oh, God.
For whatever that's worth. His connection to the Alamo, by the way, is because when he was a kid, about 5 or 6, the Fess Parker TV series, Disney TV series, and movie got shown, and he just fell in love with the story. And he tells people that when all of his buddies were out kicking soccer balls around and doing all that stuff, he was reenacting the fall of the Alamo in his bedroom as a kid. And when he became a rich, rock star with some leisure time on his hands, he became one of the world's foremost collectors of Alamo artifacts. An unexpected story, but the Alamo is full of unexpected stories. For instance, most of the defenders were not actually born in Texas. They came here from elsewhere. David Crockett came from Tennessee. Jim Bowie came from Kentucky by way of Louisiana to get here. Travis came from South Carolina. A number of them came from Ireland, oddly enough. We have a list of them all on thealamo.org, our website. In that list, you can sort by their age, by their rank, by where they came from. And it's a remarkable story, just how many people came from elsewhere to fight for Texas.
Well, the Daughters of the Republic of Texas had flags and numbers in the Alamo, so you could see that.
Yeah.
So those suddenly went away.
Well, again, the Alamo is an artifact in its own right.
I understand.
And so there are different ways at different times to exhibit different ideas getting back to 1836. That was a good one. It may come back at some point. People do like, particularly people that come from outside Texas, they like to come and see, oh, I'm from Tennessee and there were this many defenders from Tennessee. That's cool. Connect to that. There are a number of different ways to tell the same story.
People
Yeah.
who visited the Alamo
They love
in my era
Yeah.
liked that a lot. They didn't have to be from far away, so
Yeah.
that was a stripping away of kind of historical information that was on display in the sacred place where the sacred people died. So
Yeah.
shame to kind of take that down.
Some of
It
them
kind of
certainly.
dishonors the people who died and where they came from, just to, take away, in some people's opinion.
In some people's opinion.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yes.
Well, I appreciate y'all's time. I absolutely. Please copy down my email address and let me know how I can be of service.
One final thing we haven't addressed, in the cenotaph,
The cenotaph, good question. The cenotaph was finished in 1940. Just for folks who don't know, the cenotaph is that giant statue. It's 60 feet tall, marble and granite. I may get this backwards. The marble is from Georgia, the granite's from Texas, or maybe the other way around. In any case, it's marble and granite. It's quite large. It was funded by the Works Progress Administration, which is Roosevelt era. The state of Texas sought $500,000 to do some upgrades at the Alamo. One of those was the cenotaph. It cost $100,000. The other $400,000 went to the gardens in back of the Alamo. They acquired the property to build those gardens, and then they built those gardens. The cenotaph today is owned by the city. The state funded it through these federal dollars and commissioned it and dedicated it to the city of San Antonio. It stands on city property. It is, currently, there are a couple of schools of thought. The first school of thought that is under no debate at all is that the cenotaph will always stand. It is not subject to the same national conversation, this hysteria that we see over monuments everywhere. I'm sure we've all followed the story of George Washington's plaque in Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Y'all know about that one? They removed his plaque from the pew he occupied as a parishioner at that church. That's a disgrace. That's a removal of history. They did the same thing to Robert E. Lee. I'm not as big a fan of Lee, I'm a bigger fan of Washington, but they shouldn't be removing any of this stuff. Shouldn't be an issue. Cenotaph itself is always going to stand. It needs repair, and it needs names added to it. There are about 5 or 10 names of defenders that were not known in 1940. I'll give you one of those names. Damasio Jimenez. He was the last defender discovered. He was discovered in 1986, 150 years after the battle. He was discovered through some examinations of records, and he was his name was caught in kind of a loophole because his family, Alamo defenders, veterans of the Texas Revolution, were all given bounties of land. Texas, from the very beginning, has always treated its veterans with respect. And all of that land grant activity came through the General Land Office. That's what we do. So there was testimony and evidence used to establish who was a defender and who was not a defender. In Damasio Jimenez's cases, the families always had to come forward and say, I am a descendant of Davy Crockett. They proved that. He was proven at the battle, therefore they're given land. That's how that worked up until the 1870s or so. In the case of Jimenez, his family came forward. They had very good testimony. They had testimony from Juan Seguin himself, because he knew Juan Seguin. And testimony showing conclusively he was a defender. The family was not able to follow through with the paperwork. Isn't that annoying? So he was not recognized at that time as a defender. He was discovered in 86. His name needs to be added. There are names that need to be added. There are some names that are misspelled, oddly enough, as scholarship has improved over time. These things need to be done. The cenotaph, there are 2 major schools of thought on where it will stand going forward. One is it could stand where it is. It's in the battlefield, the 1836 battlefield. It was added there 77 years ago. It's been part of the history for 77 years. It could stand there. It could also be moved to a point a little bit south, just outside the gate, to get it off the battlefield so we can fully recapture as much as we can, about 90% of the battlefield. Or it could be moved a little farther south to mark where the funeral pyre locations actually were. That location, if you ever go to San Antonio, who here knows how the funeral pyre location is marked currently? Hardly anyone does. I didn't even know until pretty recently. You walk down there, you walk from the Alamo, you walk south down Alamo Street, then you turn left on Commerce Street. And if you're on the southern sidewalk, there's a little wall there, and then there's the Riverwalk down below. There's a little park on the other side of the Riverwalk. You walk down that street, there are 2 markers in that wall that discuss the funeral pyre location. They're, in my opinion, woefully inadequate. You can literally, I was walking with a reporter showing her the sites at Peggy Feedback, showing her the sites down there. We literally walked right past the marker without seeing it. She works in San Antonio, works for the San Antonio Express News, and she's in Austin most of the time. I work on this project all the time. You can walk right past these things. That's a location that is not properly marked. Whether the cenotaph is used to mark that, which is possible, or whether something else is used to mark that, it needs to be marked, because that's an important part of the story. I mean, Santa Anna, he had legislation ramrodded through the Mexican legislature that designated all the Texas revolutionaries pirates. That had specific meaning in those days, meaning you would deny them Christian burial if you killed them. When he marches to the Alamo and lays siege to it, he flies the flag, the red flag of no surrender, and he plays the Degeo, that song that meant we're going to slit your throats. We're going to kill all of you. He was obviously making a statement. It's a statement that backfired because it roused the Texans, made them realize, well, this guy is not going to negotiate. We're going to have to fight him to the death. After the battle is over, he continues this treatment of the defenders as pirates by burning them. That is why they were burned, and that's why they were taken outside the compound to that specific site. So that's where the cenotaph is. At this point, there is no final decision on
Who makes the decision, and why do they want to move it?
that decision is going to be between the city of San Antonio and the land office and the state.
Is that going to be transparent?
It will be transparent. How can it not be?
Besides the final conclusion. No, I mean, is the process going to be transparent?
It is now.
Or is it going to be, you know?
Yeah, it is now. The 2 schools of thought are it stays where it is because it's there, or it moves to one of these other locations to either get it off the battlefield because it was not part of the battlefield in 1836. Right.
But it's like a gravestone to the people who died.
It is, and that's a very powerful argument. My own way of looking at the cenotaph is I'm about 50-50 on whether it should stand where, and I don't make that decision, but I'm about 50-50 on whether it should stand exactly where it is or whether it should move. Standing where it is powerful. The Defender descendants view it as the headstone for their family. And they're right to view it that way, in my opinion anyway, because they don't have a headstone for their ancestor. Andrew Kent, one of the immortal 32, came from Gonzales to reinforce the Alamo. There was no body for him. There's no body for any of the 189 defenders. So that's a powerful argument. There's a powerful argument for marking the funeral pyre location, because it's not properly marked. And that's a major part of the story that is not understood. There's a powerful argument for having it off of the battlefield, but using it to create this sense of arrival that's number 5 on the point list. There are Defender descendants who support that, actually, moving it from the current location down to where the gazebo is now, if you can picture the complex, which is just outside the south gate. But the final decision has not been made yet.
Well, you know, I mean, and this is certainly just a matter of taste, but it's almost like all of you guys at the GLO, it's just treating everything like checkers and chess pieces. Oh, there's this piece here and that piece there.
I like
And I understand treating the footprint and recreating as much as you can, but just moving the cenotaph, that's a nasty piece of business. Oh, that doesn't matter very much. I mean, it's kind of like nothing is sacred except just the way it was in 1836. Well, there were a lot more things that came along, and especially the cenotaph. And to treat it's just a piece, we're just moving down there, you know. There's something awfully shallow about that.
I don't think that's fair to the process. Just to be honest with you, I don't think that's fair. Because we're very conscious of the fact that the Alamo is the most sacred site in Texas. And this battlefield...
Put it to a plebiscite, let the people of Texas vote on it. How would that go? Would y'all listen to them? I don't know if you would, but, you know,
I'm here listening to you right now.
Well, yeah, but the question is
on a Saturday morning on Veterans Day.
Thank you for coming. We do appreciate you coming, and I'm not against the GLO. I'm against non-transparency. I'm against people who tell you 90%, but leave out 10%, and that's the 10% you would have liked to have known. And that's the way governments work. And you don't know, you know, who's behind what and who the real hidden players are and who's giving the money. And fine, that's the way politics work, and we all understand that, but it's not good. And that's what takes from we the people, is when it's, you know, you can't see with the right hand what the left hand are doing. And so, and it particularly applies to the cenotaph, among other things. You know, who's really gonna make the decision? Who are they listening to? And do we have any input? No, we don't. No, we don't. No.
You just sign it and go stand outside.
You know. I don't have time to stand outside.
I'll give you another personal
Get a wooden
opinion.
horse.
Pardon?
What's that?
Get a wooden horse and some fancy underwear.
We need to get rid of that, don't we?
Let's get rid of him.
Yeah, and that is definitely part of this process. I'll give you another of my personal opinions on this, which is that this national conversation about, or it's not even a conversation, it's a national hysteria about removing monuments. It doesn't have anything to do with the cenotaph. However, people think it does, and they're not wrong to think it does, because we see nationally all this stuff going on. And the city of San Antonio even moved a monument themselves. My personal opinion is it should be at least a year before anything is done, because this hysteria, we don't want it to affect the Alamo. The Alamo is far too sacred a site, and these issues are far too complex and far too sacred to be subject to any of this. And I think it's probably going to end up being that, because the process is going to be the city of San Antonio conveys the land. That is the street, that is the plaza, reattach that to the church, close the street, get rid of the traffic. Then the cenotaph is a big question. City property standing on state property. How do you deal with that? It's also a historic piece of property now. The object is, and the Texas Historic Commission probably gets involved and weighs in on what is done with it. So we're a good ways away from any of that happening.
But, you know, y'all in a nice way, it's a good way. I respect what I'm hearing, I like what I'm hearing. You know, you're kind of talking about kind of a sacred mission and the heart of Texas and all of that. Well, that's the GLO's version of that, and fine, GLO is a good organization, and it's elected, the commissioner is elected. But this is really the people of the state of Texas have their own sense of sacredness about the Alamo, the cenotaph, whatever. That transcends the GLO. The GLO
Absolutely
may
right.
not be a perfect representative of, you know, and nobody's perfect. I mean, nobody's perfect representative, but the final will or the final heart of the matter is the people of the state of Texas. And to the extent that the GLO doesn't play that straight or doesn't work for real total transparency, the people sitting over, you know, out here are gonna be really bugged about it.
Yeah. And they ought
So
to.
you hear that here.
Yeah.
So what do you think is behind the removal of the statues, just personally? across the- And I have a follow-up.
There are a lot of folks out there, candidly, who hate this country and hate our history. You have the Antifa groups out there. You have a lot of folks on the progressive set, the left set, who just really are upset, and I think unjustifiably so, about a number of things in American history. And so they push these efforts to change our history, to whitewash our history.
Right.
That we're not playing that game.
And I'm not related to Senator, but this is
Yeah.
where I go back to UNESCO's.
Yeah.
The purpose is to take
Yeah.
away our history, to make
Yeah.
us global, and they're the ones that are ultimately behind this. So that's why I don't think UNESCO's gonna
Well-
keep their hands off of the Alamo.
Yeah.
If there's any way in heck they can.
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the strongest answers to that is we are Texas. Whenever you.
We're Texas, but everybody's moving in from everywhere.
Yeah, that is
Where-
a fact of life, especially I live close to Austin.
But remember, all those people that fought at the Alamo were not from Texas.
Yeah, but these are coming for different reasons. They've
Well, a lot
had
of the-
70, 80 years of education to teach them to hate America.
A lot of the refugees coming in from California are coming here because California is an economic basket case. They can't get a job, they can't found a business, they can't really raise their
We
families.
need a wall.
Yeah, but they bring their mentality that results.
Some of them do, some of them don't. Yeah, some of them learn the lesson, they come to Texas for the right reasons. The rest of them move to Travis County.
And they get shoved out to Williamson because they can't afford Travis, and so we have to subsidize all that.
I can't argue against any of that. When we moved, just so you know, when we moved back to Texas, I lived in Japan for a while, lived in Maryland for a while, came back to Texas. My wife and I consciously, yes, and my wife is actually Japanese. When we moved back to Texas, we consciously targeted Williamson County as opposed to Travis. Reason being the taxes are much lower in Williamson County. It's a red county versus a blue. And I came in as a Republican activist at that time. I was comp director for the party, the state party. And Ronnie Earl was still in power in Travis County.
By the way, we're really a purple county.
Pardon?
We're really a purple county.
We're a lot bluer than I would like.
I need to go, but I have a quick question
Sure.
or suggestion. I'm a business owner, and I'm always looking for opportunities.
Sure.
What do y'all do with the dust you sweep up every day? What do they do with it?
They keep it. That's the short answer. I'm not exactly sure where. I have to look up. But they do keep it.
Okay.
Yeah. What are you thinking?
Selling it?
Sell it.
Sell it.
I would have to think long and hard about that.
$100 bucks an ounce.
Use it
Right.
as to patch the wall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Put it back where it
$100 an
was.
ounce.
Well, no, what you do is
You're talking to a guy who collected a jar of sand from Iwo Jima, so I know where you're coming from on that. When I was in Iwo Jima twice when I was in the Air Force, and I literally took a jar the second time and scooped up some of that black sand. So I know where you're coming from on
all
that.
across the United States.
But yeah.
Let me tell you how to do it. Let me tell you how to do it. I have sand of Iwo Jima, about 8 or 10 or 15 grains
Yeah.
that are embedded in a piece of clear acrylic with a World War II stamp, and it all comes from Fredericksburg. And it's just perfect.
Yeah.
It's just perfect. That's how you used to handle that sand.
There's an opportunity there.
Could be.
I'm gonna guess
Could be.
Brian may have to leave.
I'm good.
You good?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you very much.